All right, everybody. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So we had been doing tafsir for 101 days. Do we actually call that 101st? But yes, it's the 101st day today. So that's actually, alhamdulillah, mashallah, lots of progress. And we are on ayah number 96. So we had been covering ayah number 95. يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا لَا تَقْتُلُوا الصَّيْدَ. We got over that yesterday. Today we're going to continue within, I guess, the same topic, but slightly different. Let's look into what this ayah is saying. أُحِلَّ لَكُمْ صَيْدُ الْبَحْرِ. Well, now remember, because this one, لا تقتلوا الصيد وأنتم حرم. So here we go. This is an exception. أحل لكم صيد البحر وطعامه متاعا لكم وللسيارة وحرم عليكم صيد البر ما دمتم حرما واتقوا الله الذي إليه تحشرون. So the word أحل actually means that it is permissible. The opposite of halal is haram. So أحل, it's basically not necessarily giving you the object here. So uhilla means that it is considered permissible when it was made permissible onto you or upon you, the hunting of al-Bahr. Al-Bahr is basically sea. So whether we're speaking about sea, ocean, that's al-Bahr. All of it is considered Bahr, river, sea, ocean, etc. So any area that basically is, let's say, a body of water, that would be considered as Bahr. وَطَعَامُهُ مَتَاعًا لَكُمْ. Now here's one thing. The word طَعَامُهُ actually means the food. But are we actually talking about the food? We'll get into details in just a bit, inshallah. مَتَاعًا لَكُمْ. The word مَتَاع actually means that it's goods. In other words, something that you could consume. And mata' could also mean entertaining. Okay, so al-mut'a is entertainment. Il-mata' is basically something that is considered of a good, and il-mata' could be something that could be of a place of consumption. Walis-sayyara. Now, the walis-sayyara basically comes from the word sara, and the word sara S or sin alif ra. Let me just write that down right there. The word Sara. Here we go. So this is the root. Sara. Maybe I should change the color so you could see it. Here we go. Sara would be the root. So when you say Sara, that would mean to go. So lissayyara, this is not talking about a car, but this is actually talking about those that are on a journey. So للسيارة are the people that are on a journey. So are we talking about the people that are in a state of ihram, or are we talking about anyone that's on a journey? Well, if that's halal on a person that is in a state of journey, in other words, a traveler, does that mean صيد البحر and طعامه? Does that mean that it's only permissible on the people that are on a journey, but not the people that are residents? We're going to get to that. وَحُرِّمَ عَلَيْكُمْ صَيْدُ الْبَرِّ. حُرِّمَ عَلَيْكُمْ. So this is the opposite. Let's look into this. So the word حُرِّمَ is the opposite of أُحِلَّ. Okay, let's do another one. Now we've got, and the word al-Bahr is the opposite of al-Bar. Okay, because al-Bahr means sea, al-Bar actually means the land. So now it's saying, حُرِّمَ عَلَيْكُمْ صَيْدُ الْبَرِّ. So what is considered as haram is basically the hunting that you would do on land. So in other words, it's land animals and not sea animals. ما دمتم حرما. As long as you are in a state of ihram, you're not allowed to hunt land animals, in other words, not the sea animals. I don't know if there's a specific name in English, so excuse my bad English. وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ الَّذِي إِلَيْهِ تُحْشَرُونَ. And have fear, or have that, I guess, consistency, the commitment. This is actually more accurate. Commitment to the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the one that you will be. The word is تُحْشَرُونَ. The word تُحْشَرُونَ comes from the root ha, sha, ra. Let's look into that word. Okay, we're going to look into that word. We're just going to be erasing all of these first. Now, the word ha, sha, ra. Let's type that right quickly. The word ha, sha, ra. Now, the word ha, sha, ra actually means to combine or to imprison. Okay, so tuhsharun would be that you're going to stay committed to Allah, the one that to him you would be one imprisoned or combined. So what is that? Well, that's the day of resurrection. The day of resurrection is basically the day that you would be resurrected out of the grave, and then the malaika would drive you, or I guess line you up. They would drive you to the day where you're all imprisoned in one place. Imprisonment does not necessarily mean that they're imprisoned in a particular chamber, but imprisoned to mean that they're combined in a particular area where they don't have the freedom to leave. Okay, so that's Ard al-Mahshar. Okay, so a couple of things to discuss right here in that ayah. There are 13 different issues to discuss. Let's go over one thing at a time, inshallah. أُحِلَّ لَكُمْ صَيْدُ الْبَحْرِ. So what is Sayd al-Bahr? Sayd al-Bahr is basically the hunting and everything that is from hitanihi. Now you want to look into the word hitan. It depends on which area you're coming from. They will consider the word hut to mean fish. In fact, the word hut is also meaning fish, even in Surah Al-Kahf. Remember, in Surah Al-Kahf, they use the word hut to mean fish and not necessarily whales. Okay, so when we're speaking about everything Saydul Bahr, and this is including not necessarily whales, but including fish or sea animals, and certainly here when it's talking about Saydul Bahr, we're speaking about whatever is hunted from the sea, and it was included, in other words, right there, Saydul Bahr. Remember this alif right here, which is Hamzat al-Wasl. Let's look into it, right? Hamzat al-Wasl. So whenever this would be called mudaf ilayh, and this would be like kind of like a compound word, because if you were to say uhilla lakum sayd, it would be sayd what? What are you talking about? Because this would be a word that is not defined, therefore it needed a defining article, which basically is coming for al-bahr. So sayd, uhilla lakum sayd would be let's say an incomplete sentence. So to complete it, saydul bahri. Saydul bahri, meaning what is considered as permissible here and what type of hunting is permissible. Well, it's basically the hunting that you would hunt from the sea, and that's why it was considered as mudaf ilayh right there. In other words, it now is becoming like a compound word type of thing. Okay, let's see. And mata'an, and of course, when we're speaking about mata', right there, so saydul bahri, and وَطَعَامُهُ مَتَاعًا لَكُمْ, so that it would be something that you could consider as goods, something of place of consumption. And the question is, when it said صيد البحر and it said متاعا لكم, so here we go, أحل لكم صيد البحر, and why? Because it would be متاعا لكم, so it would be permissible, it was permitted upon us to hunt from the sea because it is a good consumption, a good property that you could use. But the word طعامه is an addition to the sayd. Now that's a place of question. What is طعام? طعام is supposed to be food. So is this talking about that the sea animals are food, or what is it really saying? So when you're talking about الطعام, yes, it would refer to anything that is consumed for eating. but it would also include anything that can be consumed, whether we're speaking about water or whether we're speaking about perhaps wheat, or whether we're speaking about specific items, dates, wheat, whatever it is. It could also include other metaphorical type of consumption, or at least any other type of consuming something. It can even include meaning sleep. Now, you don't consume sleep, but believe it or not, Lugha Arabiya is such a vast language. That's why, if we want to do any form of tafsir, it's definitely not enough to go to the translation, because you really have to be very well versed in Lugha Arabiya to really understand when is it a metaphor, when is it to be literally used, and how do we understand that. So, and here he said, well, what is actually meant by طعامه is not the food or the consumption. He was saying what is actually referred to here is anything that the sea basically sheds on the side. Wait, I thought you said if it's shedding on the side, I thought you said that that was supposed to be haram because it was a dead animal. So that's what we're going to discuss. Certainly, that's the preponderant, but stay tuned and let's wait to get more details. So what some scholars had regarded that طعامه, the first opinion actually said صيد البحر is what you would actually hunt in the sea, and طعامه would be whatever the sea sheds on the shore. What would be shed on the shore? It's basically whatever probably died and then it didn't swim off. So it would basically, with the ebb and flow, it would just then get into I guess the seashores, and that animal is that طعامه. So the first opinion considered that, yes, this is what is considered as the interpretation for طعامه, and that's what was left on the seashore. Okay. The second opinion actually considered that no, صيد البحر would be what you would hunt in the sea, and طعامه would be the vegetation that's in the sea. So we're talking about things like seaweed, or probably the different plants that are in the sea, and considered that that is also to tell us that that's permissible. So whether we're speaking about sea animals, the things that were hunted, but you don't hunt seaweed, you basically collect it in certain ways. Believe it or not, Asians actually love seaweed, and they have special recipes for it. It's not my favorite. Never tried it. I can't just digest the idea, but I still have to accept that, hey, even the ayat, we're actually talking about طعامه and the seaweed, the vegetation, the different things that are in the sea. So let's see, we're going to talk about that in just a bit. Now, here's one thing. Scholars actually had differences of opinions on the animals, the sea animals, let's be more specific, and if they were, one, floating, or whether it was basically shed by the sea and it landed basically on the seashore, and whether that was going to be permissible to eat or not. Why did they even have differences of opinions? So here's the thing, is that they had differences of opinions because you had two different narrations. One, the type of narration you got, general ahadith. So we're talking about ahadith that are giving me a general information, such as طعامه ميتته الحل ميتته, that whatever is dead from the sea animals, that would actually be considered as halal. That's one narration. The other types are the different athar. What is al-athar? Stay tuned for this one. Let me clarify this one. So you've got different types of evidences. The first type of evidence, of course, we've got ayat. Okay, that's the first type of evidence. The ayat are basically the verses in the Quran. That's a clear one. The second type of evidences are the hadith. The third type of evidences are the athar. What's the difference? So this one is basically mentioned by Allah Almighty. Here we go. That's basically slash Quran. Okay. Hadith is basically going to be what was narrated upon the Prophet, and the athar is going to be the reports that were narrated off the companions. Okay. And those would be the companions or even the tabi'in as well. So now you have an idea when we're looking at the references. But here's one thing. The ayah is definitely telling us, أُحِلَّ لَكُمْ صَيْدُ الْبَحْرِ طَعَامُهُ. So does the word طَعَامُهُ actually mean, based on this, looking at these references right there, does that mean that this is our evidence to say that whatever was basically going on the shore, that even if it's dead, that would make it halal? Do we have evidences from the hadith that the Prophet ﷺ had said that the animals that are dead are, the sea animals at least, that are dead, whether we're speaking about them floating or on the shores, basically making it halal? We've got one hadith that basically said that the Prophet ﷺ had said that the sea animals, الطهور ماؤه, that the water there is basically considered pure, and al-hillu maytatuhu, and even its dead animals, they would be considered halal. Well, what about athar? What about reports? Can they at all be probably, I guess, opposing these reports? Well, sometimes it can happen that a word that's probably, just like this word, a little too vague, and that's perhaps another hadith, maybe they interpret it differently. So it can happen that you can have an athar that can interpret this one, if it's a metaphor, or if it's probably a little vague, and then they could interpret probably this one, they didn't know the hadith, or probably didn't hear of it, or probably considered it that it was abrogated, or probably did not know, or probably considered it that it's not including this area and have a specific note of information. So I want you to keep this whole scale in mind, because when you study Sharia, you're basically going back to the resources and trying to understand the references, and trying to understand also the scale of references, and how is it possible that they can have differences of opinions when we're actually looking at the scale. Okay, so let's continue right there and actually see, what does this scale really mean? And let's see, just wanted you to see this one. سائر ما فيه من نبات وغيره. This is where, of course, he's saying that this is talking about that ta'am was really talking about the vegetation, or at least the different veggies, or the different, what is it called, plants there, that's basically what is referred to in terms of this word ta'amuhu. Or is it the other way? Okay, let's see. Abu Hanifa had said, well, the fish that is floating is not to be eaten, but anything that is outside of fish, you would actually eat it. So you could, وَيُؤْكَلُ مَا سُوَاهُ مِنَ السَّمَكِ. So if it's within the sea, you could eat it. But if you could see that it's floating on top, in other words, it basically had started to decompose, that you should not be eating that. Let's see. The other thing, وَلَا يُؤْكَلُ شَيْءٌ مِنْ حَيْوَانِ الْبَحْرِ إِلَّا السَّمَكِ. Here's one opinion, and I want you to look at this one, that you cannot eat anything from the sea, here's the first opinion, except fish, only fish. In other words, can you eat things like crabs, lobsters, oysters, all of that stuff? The answer, according to this opinion, no, you could only eat fish, nothing else. Okay. And let's say, but you had al-Hasan, you had, of course, in Hassan, you basically said, no, it is hated to eat from the fish that is floating on the sea, but not necessarily haram. Now, I want you to look at this one. We talked about this before, that when we would see that a scholar would use the word ruwiya in this type of past tense and in the way that it is indicative that this is requiring further scrutiny and is not necessarily authentic. And he said it was narrated upon Ali ibn Abi Talib that he had hated eating the fish that had floated before. But you could see, I want you to look at this. This is important. But you could see that there was another narration that he actually also had hated eating aklul jirri, eating from the types of fish that is called an aridai or aridai. Let me just show you that type of fish, right? Let me show you that type of fish and what that looks like. And that's what it was narrated, that this is what it is. Here we go. Well, it has these little whiskers right there. And this is actually found in fresh waters. You could see right there, found in fresh waters. So it was mentioned that he hated eating even that type of fish. But I want you to look at this one. When you see the two things in brackets, he said, min wajhin la yathbut, that this basically means you could see that there were other narrations, or at least in other books, that had basically had shown that this is actually not evident. So we don't have enough evidence to prove that Ali ibn Abi Talib had hated eating these types of fish, that are found in fresh waters. But I want you to look at this one. وَرُوِيَ عَنْهُ أَكْلُ ذَلِكَ كُلِّهِ. And it was also narrated upon him that he ate all these types without differentiating between these sea animals that are in fresh waters or other animals that are floating. But it was actually narrated that Ali ibn Abi Talib had actually eaten all of that. And here al-Qurtubi said, and that's actually more authentic. I want you to look at this. This piece of it is very important, because if we don't combine all the different evidences regarding perhaps a sahabi or an athar or the hadith or the interpretations, etc., and we could be selective in taking one note or taking one report, then we're probably not getting the complete picture. So it's important to combine the different reports, and you could see that some reports are looking right there, looking rather contradictory, or at least contradicting one another. And that's why it's important to scrutinize those evidences. And that's why he said ruwiya. Ruwiya wanted to tell you that just because a narration was mentioned, it doesn't make it authentic. So you got to be really careful in saying, well, this was actually reported off Ali ibn Abi Talib, or this was reported off this Sahabi or the Prophet, etc., because you might actually have another report that would contradict completely the report that you have. And that's why he said, well, with the scrutiny, وَهُوَ أَصَحْ, that Ali ibn Abi Talib had actually eaten all of that. Why do we care what Ali ibn Abi Talib had eaten at all? What's the big idea?
Yeah, and what if he just didn't like it? You know what I mean?
There you go. Fair enough. What if the Prophet ﷺ, he didn't want to eat that type of lizard, and he said, well, I didn't actually have a taste for it. He just didn't like it. But then the rest of the Sahaba had eaten that lizard called a dub, and barbecued it and they ate it, but the Prophet ﷺ just didn't have a taste for it. Now, here's one thing. When we look at fi'l al-sahabi, so we know that the Prophet ﷺ is a reference, but are the companions' actions, reports, are those a reference as well? So there's something called, pay attention to this one. This is really intricate details, okay? Let's look at this one. There's something called marfu' and mawquf. What's the difference? So when we look at certain actions or certain reports that the Sahaba had done, we would then need to scrutinize, was that a personal choice, or was that something that they had probably learned from the Prophet ﷺ? In other words, it really traces back to the Prophet ﷺ himself, or let's write it right there, traces back to the Prophet himself. Okay, and versus if we're talking about mawquf, that basically leaves it to their opinion, okay, or their choice, or their wordings, or their interpretation. So why would we even care about what they had done? Because they were the ones that lived with the Prophet ﷺ, so they had the best interpretation to understanding Islam, so they became a collective resource. Keep that in mind. The Sahaba, let's actually write that. The Sahaba, the Prophet's companions, okay, they became a collective resource, which basically helps us understand Islam, because they were directly watching the Prophet ﷺ, hearing the Prophet ﷺ. They were trained by the Prophet ﷺ, and especially if we're speaking about the Sahaba that were at close relations. There are different variants in the amount of ilm that you might have in one Sahabi compared to another. So Sahaba like Abdullah ibn Abbas, Umar ibn al-Khattab, Abdullah ibn Umar, Abdul Rahman ibn Auf, those Sahaba, they were actually considered the closest ones. And of course, there are others, but basically the Khulafa al-Rashideen, and also other names like Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, etc. Those are considered the closest Sahaba to the Prophet ﷺ, and had the most information, and gave us the detailed and the most information in regards to Islam. So keep that one in mind. Do we have any female Sahaba as well? Yes, we got Aisha, we've got Salama. Those were considered the most ones to have ilm, Aisha and Salama. What about the rest of the Prophet ﷺ's wives? Well, we don't have too many reports of them, but we have more reports of Sayyidah Aisha and Salama, and some reports of some Sahabiyat, but not too many. So even when we're talking about Sahaba, you cannot compare, for example, the narrations that were narrated probably off, give me a name, a Sahabi that probably narrated only 2 ahadith or 3 ahadith. By the way, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, even though he was actually the closest, he didn't actually narrate a lot of hadith. He didn't narrate a lot of hadith because you want to remember that the Prophet ﷺ, after he had died, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq died 2 years after the Prophet ﷺ. So maybe that also explains one side of it. Umar ibn al-Khattab was not amongst those that narrated a lot of ahadith. Abu Huraira was actually known to be in the most, over 7,000 ahadith. So just picture that. And you have some other Sahaba that probably narrated very few ahadith, and not too many, perhaps like Thawban, perhaps like, give me names right now, can't think of too many, but just keep that one in mind. Okay, so the Prophet's companions were a collective resource, and that's why we need them to explain to us what they had learned from the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, someone's writing Abu Darda, the height. No, Abu Darda was not the highest, dear. Abu Darda was not the highest.
Oh, I wrote that right when you said that it's Abu Huraira, and then I
Yeah.
just sent another message saying that. I just sent it at the exact same time that you said that.
Oh, Allah yahfadak ya Rabbi. All right, let's see. So I want you to look at these that sometimes you can have contradictory resources, but that's why it's needing a lot of scrutiny. Let's see right there. An Ali ibn Abi Talib, here we go, that he had also said, Al-jarad wal-hitanu dhakiyyun kulluhu. What is dhaki? Smart? All the jarad and hitan, they're very smart? No, this isn't smart. Dhaki to mean that it is halal, as you know, the Pakistanis and Indians, they would say zabiha. That's exactly what that means. Their definition of zabiha, that's what it means. That it is in itself, it's halal to consume. So this is not talking about the locust and the sea animals as being smart. No, this is actually talking about them, that they're actually halal to eat and halal to consume, and that just by taking them out of the water, that actually means that they would be considered as let's call it prepared and ready to be eaten, and you don't have to slaughter it. Okay. Why? There's someone that actually says you have to slaughter it. Yes. The Ibadiyya, they consider that you have to slaughter the fish, and it's not enough to just get them. Now that one's really ironic, but okay. Those people are in Oman. All right. So you could see, as for Ali ibn Abi Talib, he said, well, there are differences of narrations whether Ali ibn Abi Talib had considered eating from the fish that is floating, on whether it is halal or not. So you could see Tamheed. Let's look into these ones. Who's it Tamheed? The Tamheed is for Ibn Abd al-Barr, and you could see Ibn Abi Shayba, al-Bayhaqi, and Abd al-Razzaq. Okay, I want you to note these ones. Okay, this is important. So المصنف ibn Abd al-Razzaq, Musannaf ibn Abi Shayba, those are considered the most important references, and they're almost 20, 23, depends on the copy and the print that you have. Each is almost 20, 23 volumes, and what they contain is just athar. They just, what is it? Athar, remember the reports that were narrated off the Sahaba or the Tabi'een? Who's Tabi'een? Tabi'een are basically those that learned from the Sahaba, but they didn't see the Prophet ﷺ. The Sahaba are the ones that saw the Prophet ﷺ. Okay. What about At-Tamheed? So At-Tamheed is for Ibn Abd al-Barr. That is basically one of the books that explained, it was detailed for Mudawwana, and basically explained Madhab Maliki. It's actually huge. It-Tamheed is almost in 25 volumes. It's huge. It's very big. Al-Bayhaqi basically contained a lot of the different ahadith. Al-Bayhaqi is Shafi'i madhab, but he also compiled, but you want to keep in mind that he actually died in the 5th century Hijrah, so his narrations are rather long and far off, so not short, because like al-Bukhari, because al-Bukhari died 256 Hijriya, al-Bayhaqi died 450 something. Don't take my word for it, but within that range. So we're talking about almost 200 years difference. But still, he did have in a 10 volume Sunan al-Bayhaqi, and that contained two things. It contained a hadith and it contained athar as well. It's actually huge. Yes, 10 it's like in 10 volumes. In 10 volumes, and in some printouts are actually making it in 13 and 15. It depends on the printout. But when we're speaking about Sunan al-Bayhaqi, we're talking about we're talking about a huge printout, and it contains all those ahadith and athar. And Shu'aib al-Arnaut, if I'm not mistaken, actually did a lot of tahqiq for it. Okay, let's see. Where were we? Okay. Right. So al-jaradu wal-hitan, that Ali ibn Abi Talib had said, al-jarad. What is al-jarad? Al-jarad is the locust. You know, those big grasshoppers? That's basically permissible to eat. If you don't have a taste for it, that's fine. I don't either. Every time I see people actually cooking it and I just can't stand even watching those videos. I'm like, what are you people doing? I know people in Yemen eat it and it's permissible. They say it has a lot of protein. I don't have a taste for it. Please don't invite me to locust maqlube, please. And let's go for fish, okay? I'm not a fish eater either. But anyhow, al-hitan. Al-hitan is not necessarily whales, but it's actually fish. By the way, in Bilad al-Sham, we use the word samak for fish and hoot for whales. North African countries, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, I don't know about Libya, they actually use hoot for fish. And in the Quran, it did use hoot for fish. So for those that want to doubt the Arabic abilities that North Africans have, yes, I guess I want to defend North Africans now because they were always accused of not speaking proper Arabic. But anyhow, that's a different story. Okay, what about other Sahaba? So we had about Ali ibn Abi Talib. What about other Sahaba? Did they agree with Ali ibn Abi Talib's action / report? Let's say, لم يختلف عن جابر أنه كره. Who's Jabir? So Jabir is Jabir ibn Abdullah. Jabir ibn Abdullah was actually amongst the Sahaba that had lived closely with the Prophet ﷺ. Jabir ibn Abdullah had a lot of hadith reports, and Jabir ibn Abdullah, he actually hated eating the fish that is floating fish. We're talking about floating, meaning it's a sign that it died and it's starting to decompose. Why does it float? Well, it floats because it's dead, and the gases in it that are starting to make it decompose basically make it kind of like a balloon, and it starts floating. In other words, it's starting to decompose for sure, and that's why it's floating on top because of the different methane gas that is starting to basically get trapped within that fish, and that's why it floats. Okay. And that's the same thing when we're talking about human beings. When they would die, even if they were to drown, they would eventually float because of the trapped gases inside. They would basically float. Same thing if we're talking about whales, any sea animal, when they start to decompose, the decomposition that's happening on the inside would basically get trapped inside the body because, of course, they're not breathing. So it gets trapped inside the body, and that's why it becomes like a balloon, and then it starts floating on sea. Okay, let's see. And you've got Tawus Muhammad ibn Sirin. Now, Tawus is not a Sahabi. He's a Tabi'i. He was originally from Yemen. Muhammad ibn Sirin was also a Tabi'i. Jabir ibn Zayd. So you had all of them. They basically, so are we just going to take their words just because they had said that? No. Not because one Sahabi had said something, we're just going to accept it like that. We need further investigation to really see, is that supported by a hadith as well? Is that their personal opinion? How do we understand this within the context? And that's what they actually depended on. They said, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, حُرِّمَتْ عَلَيْكُمُ الْمَيْتَةِ. Wait a minute. حُرِّمَتْ عَلَيْكُمُ الْمَيْتَةِ. What does that mean? That dead animals are impermissible / forbidden. So where did they get that from? Well, they said, well, first of all, this is an ayah, but they said the word al-mayta, they said this al is not a particular al, but that's an inclusive al. Wait a minute. What's inclusive and what's particular? How did you get there? Okay, let's look at this. So you got in Lugha Arabiya, there's the al, which basically is the identifying article, the. Okay, and then you've got When you say, for example, give me the pencils. Are we talking about in English? If we were to say the pencils, you would look at the plural pencils and you would say, okay, well, that actually means that you're speaking about all the pencils. I'm going to take everybody's pencils and give them to you. But in Lugha Arabiya, we don't necessarily have this part of an indication. So we would look at different ways to see with this al, it can be an inclusive al to mean everything that is basically identified with this al right here. Basically, what is this description right there? And there's the specific. So there would be a specific one. So if I were to say, give me the pencil, you're going to say, which one? I'd say the one in Amy's hand. Okay, the one in Amy's hand. Because she knows I said the pencil. She knows I'm talking about a specific one. Well, in English, that would be really easy to recognize that this is talking about the pencil because the word pencil that I used was in singular form. But when I use the pencils in plural form, you said it's all the pencils. In Lugha Arabiya, that's not necessarily the case. So that's why in Arabic, we would look at al-mayta. Is it inclusive, meaning al-istighraqiyya, or is it the specific one in talking about al-ahdiyya? Ahdiyya meaning the one that you and I understand, the one what we basically mean, a specific one. Okay, so these Sahaba, they said, well, here's our other evidence. It's not just our choice that we just said we would hate to eat that. Why did they use hate? Because they didn't want to use haram, because they know that that word is such a magnificent and such a, let's say, a very intricate word, and you cannot use that word unless you have strong evidence. In fact, like the Hanbali madhab, they would refrain from using the word haram and they would rather use the word makruh, even if they were to talk about something haram. So, for example, if you were to ask Ahmad ibn Hanbal, what's the ruling on alcohol? He would actually say makruh. And you would be like, makruh? Why would you think it's hated and not haram? Because he actually uses the word makruh to also mean haram too. But because the word haram is a big word, it contains a lot of weight, so they would refrain from using that word and will use the words things like makruh, which what they would refer to is really haram. So I want you to look at this one, karihahu, because they're afraid that if they were to use the word haram, that they're describing something haram, which we could see might actually contain some evidence that is probably not supporting their claim. So they would rather use the word makruh than use the word haram. So, okay, what did they say? Well, they used the generalization and this inclusivity within the word al-mayta, because the ayah said, the dead is impermissible on you to consume. So they said this al-mayta is inclusive to whether we're speaking about sea animals or whether we're speaking about land animals. If it's dead, it's included in this word. Enough said. This is what they used. And they said, well, we also have another hadith that supports our words. They said, we got a narration of Abu Dawood is Sajistani, and Sajistani, in other words, from Iran area, Daraqutni was actually one of the smartest Muslim scholars that had ever lived. He really didn't get the attention that he deserves. Daraqutni was from Iraq. Daraqutni was one of the most important scholars in Tafseer, in al-Ilal, which العلل. What is العلل? العلل, you know, when you have certain ahadith, but there's this intricate detail inside a hadith or inside the chain of narration, only very few scholars are able to spot it. الدارقطني was one, Abu Hatim was another one. You got very few scholars. Ibn Salah was one that were really smart, and they were capable of scrutinizing and doing sabr and digging those ahadith to see whether they are actually considered authentic or not. And let's see, so Ad-Daraqutni from Baghdad, why was he called Ad-Daraqutni? Because he was born in the neighborhood of Dar al-Qutn. Dar al-Qutn, right. Well, wait a minute. You know, kind of like in Damascus, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Palestine, in Baghdad, there are certain neighborhoods, depends on what is commonly sold in that area. So they would have, for example, the Bab al-Qattanin, meaning the area that was selling cotton. Another place that was probably selling maybe semen, they would be Saman. Another place they were probably selling maybe milk. They were probably Abu Laban, or another family would probably be, famous for probably Haddadin, maybe doing blacksmith. Another place, another family, Dhahabi, based on basically their based on either the place that they lived in, or perhaps the business that they carried out. So Daraqutni was actually born in the neighborhood that was known for selling cotton and cotton production. That's why his name is Daraqutni. Okay, let's see. Why am I mentioning him? You'll see in just a bit. عن جابر ibn Abdullah. He said another narration, because remember, he said, لم يختلف عن جابر أنه كرهه. See, Jabir ibn Abdullah, he said that the Prophet ﷺ said. Okay, now he's got another evidence. So the first one was an ayah. The second one, he's using a hadith. And he said the Prophet ﷺ said, كلوا ما حصر عنه البحر وما ألقاه وما وجدتموه ميتا أو طافيا فوق الماء فلا تأكلوه. That's a direct statement. Let's see what it says. Eat what was ما حصر عنه البحر وما ألقاه. What the sea had basically shed to the shores, and what you had found dead or floating over the water, then don't eat that. So what are we looking at? We're talking about, what's the difference? Well, what's the difference is we're seeing one, Tafiyan, it's still, I guess, right there at the top and still decomposing, and Hasar anhu al-Bahr, basically the sea itself shed it onto the shore. Okay, let's see. But is that hadith even authentic? So, okay, Jabir ibn Abdullah, who's the same guy that basically hated eating that, and now Daraqutni is narrating this narration off of him, also Abu Dawud as well. Let's see. Daraqutni, even though he would narrate certain ahadith, but here's one thing. He was such a great scholar that he wrote, it's like a 5-6 volume book. It's all full of hadith. Check this out. Girls, look at this one. It's all full of hadith. But the reason why he wrote that, it wasn't necessarily what he had compiled. It was supposed to be written as a test to test his students to see if they're able to classify which ahadith in there are authentic and which are not. So they would have to go over, imagine right now we would have a test probably of 50 questions and 60 questions or whatever it is, 100 questions, and then we would regard this person as qualified for their I guess, passing this particular subject or not. But al-Daraqutni was no. He was a hard teacher. He was not going to give the certificate for his students for answering a couple of questions. He needed to make sure they knew every single detail. He needed to oversee and test them farther than that. So he made a 6-volume test. It's like 5-6 volumes. Imagine that. And then the students were supposed to classify those hadith in order to pass and get the certificate or the ijazah. Just imagine that. Just imagine that. But al-Daraqutni, of course, we got the Daraqutni gave an explanation. He said, well, when we're looking at this narration, you could see that there's a certain narrator inside that narration, and he's actually weak, and that person is Abdul Aziz. He said, well, that's actually not authentic. So what do we say? Here's another narration of the same Sahabi, Jabir, that it was narrated the same thing of the Prophet ﷺ. So if we're looking at that, and you could say al-Daraqutni was the one to mention this hadith, and so did al-Bayhaqi. So how are we understanding all of this? And you could see Daraqutni again saying, well, there's no evidence that it was reported off a Thawri, and we're just going to make the story short. So then he was basically saying that this is within the area of mawquf, not marfu'. Wait, what is that again? I know I heard you say it before, but what was that again? Okay, remember, oops, right there. Remember, we said marfu' and we said the word mawquf. The word marfu' means that this narration is basically tracing back to the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Mawquf would actually be reserved, that it's the companions, reserved to the companion. In other words, it's the companion that basically said it. It's his opinion. It's his interpretation. It's his explanation. Okay, so here al-Daraqutni wanted to say that, okay, we've got these narrations, but there's a problem with these narrations. The problem is that, yes, it was narrated off the Prophet ﷺ, but that narration that it was narrated off the Prophet ﷺ, there's a problem with it. We don't actually have strong narrations that really fit that this is off the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, so now what are you going to? Well, he's saying, well, it does not fit to be marfu', meaning tracing it back to the Prophet ﷺ, but it does probably hold evidence to make it that it's reserved to his choice or his opinion, or perhaps he learned it based on perhaps his interpretation of this ayah. Okay, there we go. Let's move on. And you could say same thing. He said, well, Abu Dawud, you could say as well. He said, yes, this hadith right there, you've got, where is it? This hadith right there. He said, yes, we did say that it was narrated. Where was it? Narrated off Abu Dawud. Does it have the same problem as Daraqutni's narration? He said, oh yeah, Abu Dawud also had mentioned and indicated that there is a problem in that chain of narration. So not because something basically says قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم, it doesn't make it authentic. We have to have great and detailed ilm in order to really see that chain of narration and actually see where this is coming from. So you could see Tirmidhi was saying right there about that hadith, he said, لَيْسَ بِمَحْفُوظ. We don't actually have an authentic collection or an authentic narration of that. What's important about this is not necessarily whether you're going to decide to barbecue floating fish or not. What's important about this is to learn how we research, to learn how we set our mind to knowing how in Islam we don't play games in fiqh. It's really serious. And therefore, we really look at each and every single evidence, and it's not an issue of opinion, but it's an issue of looking at these detailed evidence. If you don't actually have ilm, then just learn how to learn, rather than start talking into what you don't know. So let's see. And right there, Daraqutni basically said, well, we do actually have another narration on Abi Zubayr, of Abi Zubayr, and he said that it was narrated marfu', that it was narrated basically attributed, and that it was tracing back to the Prophet ﷺ. And he said, actually, that narration that it was tracing back to the Prophet ﷺ, we don't actually have an authentic narration that it traces back to the Prophet ﷺ. But you could see there's another narration that some had actually attributed to the Prophet ﷺ, but at the end, we don't actually have strong evidences. Let's see the other thing. Malik and Shafi'i, and you got some al-Awza'i, who was actually a scholar in Lebanon. We talked about him. He actually died. Remember when we talked about al-Awza'i, we said he died suffocating from carbon monoxide. Yep, in Lebanon. We talked about him before. And the Thawri, okay, يؤكل ما في البحر من السمك والدواب وسائر ما في البحر من الحيوان وسواء اصطيد أو وجد ميتا طافيا وغير طاف وليس شيء من ذلك يحتاج إلى ذكاة. Okay, let's see. What's another narration? What's another opinion? So the first opinion, we're still talking about the same subject here. The first opinion was that it's makruh and hated to eat the animals that basically floated over the sea. And we basically proved that the scholars had basically, doubted, let's say it that way, the authenticity of those narrations. Let's see the other opinion. Malik al-Shafi'i ibn Abi Layla, we're going to talk about this guy one day, inshallah. And al-Awza'i, in another narration, or at least in one of the narrations of al-Thawri, that anything that is in sea, whether we're speaking about sea animals or whether we're speaking about probably animals that are amphibians or other sea animals, whether those sea animals had been hunted or whether they were found dead, floating or not floating, then they're all considered halal and they don't necessarily need zakah. Not zakah, zakah. Wait, what's the difference between zakah and zakah? Isn't that just a person that just doesn't know how to say the za sound? No, that's not what it is. Zakah, okay, zakah is basically, the zakah, the zakah 2.5% of your nisab, and whenever you have that amount of money that you would pay zakah for, that's zakah. Zakah, let's, with that dhal, zakah is different. Zakah is basically to kill the animal in a specific way to prepare it, basically to prepare it for consumption. Consumption. Okay, here we go. So in other words, if we're speaking about, let's say, slaughtering a goat, zakah would be to cut the vein that connects between the rest of the body and the brain. That would be zakah. For camels, it would be called in nahr. It's a specific way to basically, because their anatomy is different. Okay, that's why we would do nahr for camels and we would slaughter for cows and for sheep. What about other things? So just by, he's basically saying, if you were to take out and find sea animals, that in itself, if you were to just take it out okay, that's in itself is enough to do الذكاء. In other words, it's enough to consider that it's halal. Just by taking it out, of course, it's going to get suffocated. With a suffocation, it basically becomes dead. Okay? And this sea animal, you don't have to slaughter it just by taking it out or even finding it already dead, that's in itself killed, and the way it died is enough for it to be considered halal for consumption. In other words, you don't necessarily have to kill it, but it would be dhaka, that way of how it basically died, that in itself is a form of dhaka. Khalas, that's it. It's all set. Okay. So what is the evidence? If you want to say that whether it's floating or whether it's not floating, or whether you had really hunted it, got your net and boom, got all this fish, what's the evidence? Let's see. Here's the evidence. هو الطهور ماؤه الحل ميتته. This is the general evidence. This hadith you really got to memorize. هو الطهور ماؤه الحل ميتته. Just a couple words. How many words is that? 4. Huwa, it is when the Prophet ﷺ was asked in regards to sea and whether they can make wudu from seawater or not. He responded, Huwa tahuru ma'uhu. Its water is basically pure. Al-hillu maytatuhu, and its dead is considered halal. Let's look at number 1. Let's see. This hadith was narrated in Muwatta, narrated in Ahmad, narrated Abu Dawood, Ibn Majah, Tirmidhi, in Nasa'i. Look at all that. Tirmidhi said it was Hasanun Sahih, Ibn Majah, Ibn Jabir. So you've got all those basically telling us that, hey, this is actually hadith that is authentic. Okay, so this is their first evidence. Okay, let's write number 1 on that one. Let's go for a second evidence. You got a second pair of evidence? And he said, وَأَصَحُّ مَا فِي هَذَا الْبَابِ مِنْ جِهَةِ الْإِسْنَادِ. The most authentic, now this is al-Qurtubi quote. He said, and let's, quote al-Qurtubi right there. And he said, the most authentic evidence basically from the chain of narration side of it, in regards to the question that we're discussing in this chapter, he said is basically this hadith about Jabir in terms of the whale, and when they had caught a whale that is called al-Anbar. Al-Anbar is basically the sperm whale. What happened? You could see that there is a hadith that was narrated is Sahihan. What is a Sahihan? It's basically Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, and those are basically considered the most 2 important references. Basically, here we go, Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, and he said, in fact, it's also in Musnad Ahmad as well. Okay, great. Let's see, what is the story? And he said, فَلَمَّا قَدِمْنَا الْمَدِينَةَ أَتَيْنَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم فَذَكَرْنَا ذَلِكَ لَهُ فقال هو رزق أخرجه الله لكم فهل معكم من لحمه شيء فتطعمون فأرسلنا إلى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم منه فأكله. Okay, what happened? Jabir ibn Abdullah, he basically said that they were off somewhere far. Okay, and they actually caught, well, at least they didn't catch it per se, but they found a sperm whale dead and it was off the shore. That's what they found. They were extremely hungry. So they ate, they were 18 men, almost 18 men. They ate from that sperm whale. I guess it was so obvious that they ate so much of it to the point that in another narration that they gained weight and so much weight off eating that sperm whale. So they were definitely just having a blast off that sperm whale. And when they came back to Medina, of course, they didn't have WhatsApp to call the Prophet ﷺ, send a fast question, anything. So they did their own, I guess, their own assumption and considered that it was halal. But when they came to the Prophet ﷺ, they told him what had happened and how they had found a sperm whale basically off the shore. And the Prophet ﷺ told them, quote, هُوَ رِزْقٌ أَخْرَجَهُ اللَّهُ لَكُمْ. It's basically a provision that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you. So when you call it rizq and provision, that actually means that it's halal. Because al-haram is not rizq. Al-haram is not rizq. Al-haram would not be considered as a provision that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you. Okay. And the Prophet ﷺ said, do you have anything from its flesh to give us? In other words, share with us. So they sent to the Prophet ﷺ some of what they had found from the sperm whale, and the Prophet ﷺ had eaten it. Okay. So you could see, what is this? This hadith is actually Sahih. How? It was mentioned in this two Sahihain. I want you to look at here, just aside. And he said, al-lafdhu li Muslim. So if you have Sahih al-Bukhari, why would you quote off Sahih Muslim? Let me tell you a secret. The secret is, Malikis, they honor Imam Muslim more than Imam Bukhari. Did I say that right? Yes. So Malikis, they would consider Imam Muslim's ahadith at a higher level of authenticity than Sahih al-Bukhari. Unlike all the rest of the madhahib, al-Malikis, to them, Sahih Muslim is more accurate. Okay, let's see. And they'll have this debate, but they would still consider Sahih Bukhari is accurate, okay? And they would still consider it as a strong reference, but I'm just letting you know. Okay, let's see. There's another person. So we talked about Jabir ibn Abdullah. We talked about Ali ibn Abi Talib, those two narrations and how they hated it. All right. Now we've got, well, there's another Sahabi. He said, that's it, Abdullah ibn Abbas. Who's Abdullah ibn Abbas? Just an idea. Abdullah ibn Abbas was the Prophet's cousin. When the Prophet died, he was about 13 years old. But the Prophet had made a dua for Abdullah ibn Abbas, Allahumma faqihhu fi ad-din wa 'allimhu at-ta'wil. Ya Allah, give him the knowledge in the faith and the intelligence to have the ability to interpret the religion, explanation of the Quran, etc. And he said, أشهد على أبي بكر wait a minute. أشهد على أبي بكر أنه قال السمكة الطافية حلال لمن أراد أكلها. That he had said, he basically said, أشهد على أبي بكر. What does that mean? He said, I had witnessed that Abu Bakr as-Siddiq had said. Well, wait a minute. But you're a Sahabi. Why are you talking about Abu Bakr as-Siddiq? Because there's a huge age difference. Ibn Abbas, it was 13 years old. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq had a long and a strong and a long legacy with the Prophet ﷺ. And he said, I'm a witness that Abu Bakr as-Siddiq had said, quote, السمكة الطافية حلال لمن أراد أكلها. That he had said that the fish that is floating is halal unto whoever wants to eat it. If you have the taste for it, then go ahead. Let's see. I want you to look at this one. Sunan al-Daraqutni and Abd al-Razzaq. Remember, because this is, where was it? Where was it? Okay, here we go. That this is an athar. This is an athar. Okay. I want you to look at this one. What about this athar right there? Number 3. Let's go to number 3 in the footnote. And he said, Sunan al-Daraqutni. Okay, that's a reference right there. Ibn Abd al-Razzaq, because it's an athar, I definitely need to go to Ibn Abi Shayba and Ibn Abd al-Razzaq. Okay, we found it right there. But then he said, ذكره البخاري معلقا كما في الفتح. What does that mean? Al-Bukhari has something called mu'allaq. And that is, so ahadith al-mu'allaqa in al-Bukhari don't actually have a complete narration. But doesn't that make it non-authentic? Certainly it does. But al-Bukhari would mention these mu'allaqat inside as an aiding evidence to some of the hadith that he had mentioned. And these mu'allaqat, so he would not necessarily mention all the chain of narration, and that's the reason why one main catch that Malikis preferred Imam Muslim's compilation over al-Bukhari's, one main reason was al-mu'allaqat. But there's one thing. Does that mean that some hadith in al-Bukhari are not authentic? Well, those would be al-mu'allaqat. But here's one thing. I want you to look at this one. There is another scholar. His name is Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, where was he from? Asqalan. Where's Asqalan? It's basically like 20 miles off Gaza. But he wasn't actually raised there. He was raised in Egypt. He had a sister who was his main tutor, Sittul Rakb. Both his father and mother died. Well, his mother died when he was still an infant. His father died when he was just a toddler. And then the person to raise and basically take care of him was his father's friend. Just imagine, was his father's friend. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani went over those hadith that are mu'allaqa, and he started searching for the evidence and to see whether he can manage to find the different connections, in other words, the missing links inside those hadith. Am I capable of finding the missing links? So he did manage to find, I think there were 96 hadith, if I'm not mistaken. So let's say Taghliq al-Ta'liq, and he compiled them. It's actually not too big. It's like in a couple volumes right there, just in 5 volumes. And this is basically what he compiled. He would go back to the hadith, and he would go back to the different mustakhrajat and all the different basically mustadrakat, etc., and see the missing links. And all he did was just look into these missing links. Here's the book. This is it. You could see this one is a 3-volume copy. This was in 5. The copy that I used to go back to was actually in 9 volumes. Can't find it. Where is it? Can't find it. I guess that was an old copy. It was an old copy, but it was in 9 volumes. This one, they have it in a newer copy in 9 volumes. It was a black and red copy. That was in 9 volumes. But anyhow, okay, now we see Taghliq al-Ta'liq. Okay, and of course, what are we looking at? What we're looking at right there, and their narration, أشهد على أبي بكر أنه قال السمكة الطافية حلال لمن أراد أكلها. So there's a narration. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, that he had basically said, I witnessed that Abu Bakr as-Siddiq had basically said, Samakatu Tafiya, that any fish that is floating is basically halal, whoever wants to eat it. Let's see. And there's another chain of narration. It basically said of Abdullah ibn Abbas as well, that he basically said similarly the same thing, but in a different way. أشهد على أبي بكر أنه أكل السمكة الطافية على الماء. That he had actually eaten, and he witnessed him eating the fish that was floating off the water. Let's see. There is another narration. Let's see. An Abi Ayyub. Who's Abi Ayyub? Abu Ayyub Sikhyani. He was a scholar from al-Basra. Where's al-Basra? Al-Basra is in Iraq. By the way, Iraq actually had some of the greatest scholars. I mean, greatest. And one of the main reason for that, other than probably genetically intelligent, but one of the main reasons was because the Abbasid Khilafah actually had its capital there. So the capital was there, and if you're in the capital, of course, you're getting all the different privileges that the country would basically, I guess, focus all the good infrastructure, the privileges, etc. People are going there because, of course, the government is there and all the different centers, etc. are there. So you had the resources were accessible to a lot of the Iraqis because the capital was in Baghdad. So it was easy for them to find that resource. And that's why you would find a lot of scholars coming from Iraq. Okay, Abu Ayyub al-Sakhtiyani, we'll talk about him later, inshallah. That he had basically rakib al-bahr, rode on the sea, basically went onto the sea. في رهط. What is الرهط? Differences of opinions in Lugha Arabiya on whether الرهط is 3 to 9, or whether it's 3 to 17, or whether it's less than 20. At the end of the day, it's a group of men. Okay, but it's only men. الرهط does not include not a single woman. الرهط can only be men. Okay. And they found a fish that was floating on water. So they asked to Abu Ayyub al-Sakhtiyani, and they said, is it أطيبة هي? And he said, أطيبة هي لم تغير؟ قالوا نعم. قال فكلوها وارفعوا نصيبي منها وكان صائما. So they asked him about that floating fish. He said, أطيبة هي لم تغير? Is it good? In other words, لم تغير, like it doesn't have a foul smell. In other words, it's not showing signs of it getting decomposed. It's not smelling bad, and it's looking like it's in good shape. And they said, yes. He said, eat it and preserve and keep my share on a side. And he was fasting. So what did he want to consider? The part that in order to make sure that it is still permissible to eat, it wasn't enough to just have it floating, but he was looking further that, well, you want to make sure that it didn't start to decompose and it's not starting to go bad. So that's why he said, أطيبة هي. Let's say another narration that Abu Talha, they basically found a fish. I really wanted to give you some of Abu Ayyub al-Sakhtiyani and al-Daraqutni. I even prepared for that, but let's see. Oh, it's 1:40 already. Okay, we're just gonna, let's see, we're going to stop right here, inshallah. Let's see, Abu Talha, basically something similar, and he said, ihduha li. ihduha ilay or ihduha li. What does that mean? Fi mim ihduha ilay. So remember the scholars that were reviewing the Tafseer al-Qurtubi, they had multiple manuscripts for Tafseer al-Qurtubi. So they basically would compare the manuscripts. One manuscript they would label as mim, and another manuscript they would probably label as fa, and another manuscript that they probably found in London, they'll probably label it as lam, etc. So he's basically indicating that in another manuscript that they had labeled already meme, and it would be in the introduction to tell you exactly which one they're referring to and where they got it from. So it's basically telling you, well, in another manuscript there's a different typed word or written word. It was ihduha ilay. At the end of the narration, at the end of the story, just realize that you've got differences of opinions in that regards, and what's more important than eating the fish, whether it's, I guess, floating or not, what's more important is learning how we scrutinize these intricate details and how ilm al-fiqh is not, I don't want to say hard, but I would want to say that it's not based on personal opinion. It's based on certain evidences, and every detail matters. And it's important that we would expand our ilm, and especially in knowing how this science how this science is taught and how we research. Before, we would just say, yeah, it's halal, and that's basically it, and think that we found an evidence here and there, and not realize that the scholars actually did a lot of work before they actually came to a certain conclusion. Tomorrow, inshallah, is eating things like, let's say, these capybaras, I think it was called. What about eating different animals? Maybe seahorses, seals? What about dolphins? What about sharks? Stay tuned. That's what we're going to talk about, inshallah, tomorrow. Well, wait a minute. Aren't they carnivores? So what about frogs? Are those haram? Wait a minute. Let's see. Frogs right there. What about, wait a minute. What about what is called khanzir al-bahr? Things like guinea pigs. But no, it's not a guinea pig. It's basically a different kind of an animal. In Arabic, they call it khanzir al-bahr, which basically means, kind of like when you say sea animals, when you say, no, seahorses, it's not a horse, but it was called seahorse. Has nothing to do with horses. The same thing in Arabic. They will say kalb al-bahr for seals, which actually means the sea dogs, but it has nothing to do with dogs. But they still called it sea dogs. Okay, kalb al-bahr. Oh, but the same thing with capybaras. I think that's what if I'm pronouncing this right. In Arabic, it's called khanzir al-bahr, which actually means sea pigs. But is it really a pig? Is it haram just because it has the word pig in it? What is the ruling on that? Are we going to use the name as the evidence to say whether it's haram or halal? Wait a minute. So what is that animal? You all, like beavers? It's kind of like a beaver. It lives on water and also the shore, and part of its life is on land and part of it is in water. And does that make it halal or haram? So tomorrow we're going to discuss that because there's a lot of fun stuff there, inshallah. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer it, inshallah. I hope I didn't confuse you and everybody's quiet because I'm assuming that some of you got confused, but don't worry. In the beginning, it might seem like it's confusing. I'm using a lot of words and etc., but I do repeat and repeat on purpose because I want you to remember all of this, because I do recognize not all of you have the time to review the words and review what we're studying. So inshallah, with repetition comes, of course, affirmation. And inshallah, with repetition comes more, inshallah, review and study. So don't get bored of repetition, because that's going to help you, inshallah, down the road. You're going to know that I'm going to repeat something, and once you know something's going to be repeated, that's when you know that you had really memorized it and you had really gotten it in place. And inshallah, you will, once we finish, inshallah, Surah Al-Ma'idah, we'll get to Surah Al-An'am. We'll continue and we'll be basically, inshallah, continuing a lot. So look, this is how much we had passed from the 8th juz'u. Remember, we've got 20 juz'u. We already did 8 volumes so far from Tafseer al-Qurtubi, and continue, inshallah. Hopefully you'll get to the 20th volume and we'll have all Tafseer al-Quran in complete detail. And with this tafsir, you will not only have ilm al-tafsir, but you can see we're including ilm al-hadith, we're including ilm al-lugha al-arabiya, we're including ilm al-fiqh, we're including ilm al-hadith with its different formats, we're including all the different sciences that relate to Islam. So in this tafsir class, you're not just learning tafsir, but you're actually learning all the different sciences of Islam. So congratulations. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to hear it or hear them. حبيبة قلبي Sophia. So what I'll do, since nobody wants to be recorded,